Welcome back to Biology. My name is Mr. Kubuske. I apologize for the low tones, but we're actually sitting in the back of the library, so that's why I'm not able to be as boisterous as I usually am, but hopefully the message still gets across. So we left off last time in evolution talking about natural selection and some of the drivers behind it, some of the identifiers for it, and we left off and left out kind of an important part that I wanted to pick up with right here, which is the idea of gene flow and genetic drift. So this is how we maintain a species once a species has been created, and without these, isolation can occur. So gene flow is the natural movement of alleles in a population. So in other words, you haven't necessarily cut off any parts of the species that have a specific trait, and that trait's allowed to pass, blue eyes, for example, in a population, naturally. And genetic drift is the idea of like immigration and emigration, like bringing these alleles into a population or out of a population or a group in that population naturally. Because as soon as that immigration or emigration stops, that's when isolation occurs, and that's when we can start to create a new species. So if you want to think about human beings, like for a time, there were different pockets of human populations that you started to see. There wasn't gene flow, there wasn't intermixing or intermingling of the different characters from the different populations, and so they started to become unique and started to become their own. And an African population, European, Asian, Indian, and I don't mean Indian as in Native American. Like again, you can see how each of those populations has specific traits that kind of identify them. So if they were allowed to stay within those populations, they would have become their own species, maybe even subspecies. But instead, immigration and emigration kind of kept occurring in small amounts, but has grown over time, and so that those genes are allowed to flow naturally through our population. And basically, they've increased the viability of our population because there's more genetic variation within our population, which is not a bad thing. That's actually a beneficial thing when it comes to the survival of the species. So, gene flow and genetic drift are directly impacted by something called the bottleneck effect or the founder effect. So the bottleneck effect has to do again with the Hardy-Weinberg equation and things like that, but it's an abrupt change in gene flow. So in other words, we have a pretty typical population, a large size, whatever, but then there's a catastrophic event, whatever that may be. So if you think about it this way, like let's say I've got this population of smiley faces, some yellow, some blue, some green. And over time, that population, the numbers inside that population pretty much don't change, but then all of a sudden there's a major catastrophe, and that completely changes the numbers within my population. Well, now I've got mostly blue faces as opposed to mostly yellow. So what will happen over time? Well, obviously, those numbers aren't going to change because these are the amounts within the population. So the bottleneck effect is the idea that you had this big population that now shrinks right suddenly, and whatever you have left at that shrinking point is pretty much what you're going to have from here on out. The founder effect's basically the same thing. It's just now we're taking a population, we're starting a new colony or a new population just with the ones that we've brought over, and whoever's there, whatever genes are there, that's what you reproduce with. So the founder effect is again an example of the bottleneck effect. So if we actually go back to this is where we can pick up with our last topic, which we're going to talk about, which is the evidence for evolution. And so that's what we're picking up here. So again, we've talked about natural selection. We talked about the different drivers of it. So now we're going to talk about some evidence behind it. Okay. So Darwin actually did a pretty good job within that book on the origin of species of laying out some pretty big pieces of evidence. But we've actually come up with even more since then, and even more has been done. So we're going to identify three major pieces of evidence. The first one is the one that Darwin identified. Fossils. So fossils are just remnants of once living creatures. They are not actually the creatures themselves. We want to talk about like we see those things as dinosaur bones. Actually, that's just a rock in the shape of a dinosaur bone. What happens is that the bone creates a mold, and then rock replaces it and becomes like a cast within that. So there's lots of different types of fossils: bone, bark, shells, even dinosaur poop. And basically what we do with that fossil record is that we show the relatedness of all the different organisms. Now, some people that want to challenge us will say, well, we don't have every piece of the fossil record, and so it's inconclusive to say that we have everything. Well, that's because not everything can become a fossil or leave behind a fossil. A very specific sequence of events has to occur. Fossils can only be found in sedimentary rock, which means that the dinosaur or living organism, whatever, had to have been fossilized within like a bed of a river or a lake or something like that, and then sediment had to quickly pile on top of it. And so over time, more and more layers keep piling on top of that rock, and basically, again, leave this imprint of the dinosaur fossil or a skeleton in the rock layers. That bone, as it decays away, is then replaced by rock, and then that's what we're left behind with. So if the dinosaur or whatever species or living thing didn't die in this exact location, then it could not leave behind a fossil for us to find. So that's why the fossil record will always be incomplete, and people will always point at that and being like, I don't know if that's quite right. Dating, now I'm not talking about what you do with Tinder and things like that. Dating has more to do with like how we date the age of the fossils. So there's two ways to do it. The first one's called relative age, and that's the idea that when we look at rock layers, knowing that in sedimentary rock, the youngest rock layers are at the top and the oldest ones are down below because they had to be there first before the other layers could pile on top. So basically we can point at the different layers and say, oh, if I find a fossil here, that's obviously younger than one that's found down here. That's a relative age. We can't say a specific age, but that's, we can get a relative age based on that. So like if you look at this example here, I is the oldest layer and B being the second, even though there's been a shift in the fault line, so there was obviously some type of event that occurred here that kind of tells us, oh, there must have been an earthquake and land changed forms. H was probably some type of volcanic eruption that occurred. So again, you can start to see how we can piece together the history of not just the fossils, but the history of our planet using relative dating. And then we can get our actual age based on dating, radioactive dating, using carbon-14 or uranium-238 to get half-lives. Using their half-life, so we can figure out the age of things. So basically what a half-life is, it's half of the amount of carbon or uranium or whatever it takes for half of that to decay away, that's known as a half-life. So carbon's is about 5,000 years. So in other words, let's say I have 100 grams of carbon. After 5,000 years, I'll only be left with 50 grams of carbon. Well, after another 5,000 years, I'll have half of that, which is 25. So we can start to use the amount of carbon that's left over compared to whatever it decays into as a way to figure out the age. So anything that's older than tens of thousands of years, that's when we start to use things that have a longer half-life, like uranium, which is 4.5 billion years half-life. So you can start to see how we are able to actually tell the age of the planet, the age of the solar system, using things like uranium and things that have a larger half-life. But we can get a pretty precise date to those fossils using that. And then the last thing with fossils, and this is something we touched on earlier with Darwin, is the idea of biogeography. In other words, we're looking at the distribution of fossils over time, and what we can start to see is migration patterns. We can start to see how the continents were once together. This is where the idea of Pangea came about. So biogeography has to do with where the distribution of of living things are on the land. Another good example is when you look at latitudes. Why do you see certain types of creatures at certain latitudes, even though it's on different continents? That's because they might be better suited for those areas. The second big piece of evidence is DNA. The more DNA you have in common, specifically the more amino acid sequence you have in common, because remember, amino acid sequence is determined by your DNA. That determines how closely related you are to other species. So for example, if we compare the human amino acid sequence to things like chimpanzee, well, there's no difference in the amino acid sequence for a certain protein between humans and chimps. Well, that tells you that they must be pretty closely related, especially when you consider humans to something like a bullfrog, where we have 20 differences. So again, we're closer related to chimps than we are to bullfrogs, but we're closer related to bullfrogs than we are to things like a wheat germ. So again, you can start to see the more DNA you have in common, the more you are related, basically.
Different creatures have different genes, which is ultimately why their bodies look and function differently. But one of the many reasons scientists believe all life on Earth is related is that the basic DNA code, the language of A's, C's, T's, and G's, is pretty much the same for all living things. Many creatures even share some of the same genes. You might not be too surprised to learn that humans and chimps, which are closely related, share 96% of their genetic code. But what would you think a lowly fruit fly has in common with a beautiful swimsuit model? Surprisingly, about half of its genes.
There you go. So again, the more DNA you have in common, the more closely related. To go along with this is the study of embryology. So this is where we're actually studying the embryos and their development into fetuses and into babies, or into the youth of whatever species you happen to be looking at. And what you notice is at the early stages in embryo development, you can see there's not much difference between these four species: lizard, tortoise, pig, and human. And then as they develop, if they go further, you can see they're starting to split off. These two look more similar to one another, and then these two look more similar to one another. Well, that should make sense because pigs and humans are mammals, whereas lizards and tortoises obviously are reptiles. And so then finally they become these developed fetuses down here at the bottom. You can see some big time differences, but again, some similarities as well. So again, the longer that embryo is similar to another embryo of a different species, that starts to tell you how closely related the two species are. All right, third big piece of evidence, and probably the most damning, is morphology. So, in other words, you're looking at the physical characteristics and how many you have in common with something else. This is really easy to do and makes total sense. So, if you have things called homologous structures, so these are structures that are similar between you and another species, but they came from the same ancestor, that must mean you're pretty close related. The more homologous structures you have, the more closely related you are. So, here's a good example. So we see in humans, cats, whales, and bats, definitely different appendages altogether. You know what I mean? Think about a human arm compared to a whale fin, compared to a cat leg, compared to a bat wing. They look completely different. But when you look inside them, what you see are the exact same number and the exact same types of bones, just in kind of a different formation. Well, that's because they all came from the same common ancestor that had the same type of bones. And so they are still there, so that tells us that these things are all related. So homologous structures, those are structures that are similar because they came from the same ancestor. Analogous structures are structures that are similar because of the environment and not because of an ancestor. So this has to do with like convergent evolution. So if you think about fins of a shark, a penguin, and a dolphin, obviously they all kind of look the same, but when you actually get into them and see, you can see that physiologically, like in other words, what they're made up of is a lot different. So that tells you that they're from different ancestors, but because they live in the same population, that these things give you an advantage, and so that's why they have a better chance of survival. Wings of a bird, bat, and butterfly are another great example. All used to fly, but come from different ancestors, so that's an analogous structure. And the last one, and maybe the most important one, is a vestigial structure. These are things like your tail. Yes, you have a tail, and you're sitting on it right now. These are structures that were once useful to an ancestor that are no longer useful, so they start to be diminished and eventually will just go away. Like your wisdom teeth, like your goosebumps, like your pinky toe. Dude, don't don't at me on that one. That's gonna happen, but it's gonna be for thousands of years. Okay. So appendix is another good example. Believe it or not, whales still have a pelvis. They don't use it for anything, so it's getting smaller and smaller. And some snakes even are still born with little bumps for legs. So basically what we do with these structures is we put them on something called a cladogram, and we study them with something called cladistics or phylogeny. So it's a method of putting all the same types of species on this big chart, and then basically as they have homologous structures, you link them together. So in other words, everything from this point on above has a vertebrate. Well, that makes sense. But as soon as we get to bony skeleton, sharks break off because they don't have one, but everything beyond that point still has one. Up here, amniotic egg. So in other words, everything before that lays an egg. Everything after that has an egg, a different type of egg than the amniotic egg. Now you may say crocodiles lay eggs. Well, yes, but their egg is very different from that of an amphibian egg. But it's very similar to that of a bird egg, so that's why these two end up on a similar line. So it may be striking you to realize that birds and reptiles are actually really close related. In fact, it's our best guess that dinosaurs are probably closest related to birds more than even their own reptile ancestors or reptile cousins. So the cladograms are basically just big family trees where they're broken up by those traits, those homologous structures. So each time you break off, that means you do not have that structure, and everything beyond that point has one. So this is a great way for us to kind of link everything together, and we create what's called a phylogenic tree or a tree of life based on that. I believe we have one more thing. This is where, here we go, 1 more minute left. So this is how we were able to figure out that the birds are the closest relative to dinosaur because they share the most traits in common. Their homologous traits include hollow bones. That's why birds are able to fly. It's because dinosaurs were so fast. They both have this unique S-shaped neck. They both have the 3-toe, 1-toe thing with the 3 toes in front. Think like Jurassic Park, the Tyrannosaurus Rex puts its foot in the ground and it makes that 3-1. Birds are the only other species that have that. And scales are basically just feathers are just elongated scales. So believe it or not, birds are actually the closest relative of the dinosaurs. And then this leaves us with our last point. Humans did not evolve from monkeys. Monkeys and apes, like humans, are both primates, so that means they all came from the same ancestor. So when everyone says that, humans and monkeys are not the same thing. Chimps are actually our closest relative. So hopefully